No one could reach the sniper. Not command. Not the QRF. Not the three-man team that went up the ridge and came back 2 men short. The radio had gone dark at 0430, and the valley below was bleeding. 17 soldiers pinned behind a crumbling wall with nowhere left to go and a clock that kept counting down in the wrong direction. Command had tried everything. Called in coordinates, rerouted assets, burned through frequencies until the static swallowed every word whole. Then someone said the name nobody was supposed to say out loud. Call sign, Nightshade. They said it like a last resort, like a prayer you only remember when everything else stops working. Because Nightshade wasn't in the official rotation, wasn't on the briefing board, wasn't assigned to the valley or the ridge or anything connected to this operation. But somewhere in the dark above that wall, 17 men were still breathing. And that meant she hadn't left yet. Before we show you what she did on that ridge alone, and the moment her call sign came back over the radio and stopped the entire operation center cold, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Subscribe with the bell icon on, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. And the line she transmitted before she went dark for good, no one who heard it has forgotten it since. The heat at forward operating base Kestrel came in waves, not all at once. It rolled off the packed earth in slow, invisible surges that made the air above the gravel shimmer like something alive. By 0600, it was already 94 degrees. By noon, the thermometers that still worked read 112. The ones that didn't work read nothing at all, which was somehow more accurate. Staff Sergeant Delia Cross stepped off the logistics transport at 0712 with 1 rucksack, 1 hard case, an expression that gave nothing away. She was 31, medium height, lean through the shoulders, dark brown skin weathered at the temples and the backs of her hands from years of being outside in places that didn't appear on public maps. Her hair was pulled tight beneath a standard issue cap. Her uniform bore no unit patch, no visible decoration, nothing that would tell you who she was or what she'd done or how many times she'd been to places exactly like this one. The hard case was the only thing that might have told you something, but only if you knew what to look for. And at FOB Kestrel, on the morning of the 14th, nobody did. At the motor pool, Specialist Trenton Hayes leaned against a Humvee hood and squinted in her direction. Replacement medic? He asked his buddy without lowering his voice. His buddy, Corporal Whitfield, shrugged. Intel, maybe. Looks too clean for fire support. She's carrying a Pelican case. Photographers carry those. Hayes snorted. What's a photographer doing at Kestrel? Neither of them asked her directly. That was the thing about Kestrel. Nobody asked. You learned fast that asking the wrong question to the wrong person cost you in ways that didn't show up on paper. Delia walked past both of them without turning her head. She didn't need to. Her peripheral awareness was calibrated to a degree most people couldn't train toward no matter how long they tried. She noted the motor pool layout, the gap in the eastern perimeter fence where 2 sandbags had shifted, the rooftop position on the south tower that was unmanned despite the fact that it covered the only blind approach from the valley road. She noted all of it and said nothing. The ops center was a converted supply, tent reinforced with plywood, corrugated steel, and a generator that rattled like a man clearing his throat every 40 seconds without ever finishing. Inside, maps covered 3 walls. A large screen on the 4th showed live drone feed of the Darshan Valley and the ridge system above it, a jagged spine of limestone and shadow that the locals called the Teeth. Captain Louis Okafor stood at the center table with his arms crossed and the look of a man who had stopped sleeping 2 days ago and wasn't planning to start again anytime soon. Mid-40s, built like someone who'd earned every inch of that frame, eyes red at the edges. He commanded the combined ground element at Kestrel and had spent the last 72 hours watching a situation in the Darshan Valley move from difficult to dangerous to something the briefing documents hadn't prepared him for. He glanced up when Delia entered. Took her in once. Looked back at the map. Cross, he said. Sir, you're late by 3 hours. Transport delay epigram. I walked the last 4 kilometers. He looked up again, this time longer. 4 kilometers of that ridge trail at night. The trail wasn't the hard part, she said. The elevation change was. She set her rucksack against the tent wall, and placed the hard case flat on the table beside the map. What's the current situation in the valley? Okafor studied her for another beat, something recalibrating behind his eyes. Then he turned back to the screen. Bravo element, 17 personnel, forward position along the southern wall of grid 22 Tango. They pushed in at 0200 to secure an extraction corridor for 3 civilian aid workers. The corridor closed before they could use it. He tapped the map. 2 elevated firing positions on the ridgeline have them completely suppressed. We've had 2 Kia for wounded in the last 6 hours. QRF attempted an approach up the eastern slope at 0330 and took casualties before reaching the midpoint. Delia looked at the map. Her eyes moved across the contour lines the way most people read text. Not left to right, not top to bottom, in a pattern that meant something. What's the visibility window from position Alpha? She asked, pointing at the northern spur of the ridgeline without hesitation. Okafor's operations sergeant, a hard-faced woman named Vasquez, looked up from her terminal. How do you know that's Alpha? Because it's the only position that covers both the wall and the eastern slope simultaneously. If I were setting up a suppression trap, that's where I'd anchor it. Delia's finger didn't move. Visibility window? Vasquez looked at Okafor. He nodded once. Approximately 800 meters of clear line of sight to the Bravo position. Maybe 950 to the slope. And position Bravo? She moved her finger to the southern spur. Covers the road and the extraction corridor. They've had 2 shooters there confirmed. Delia straightened. She unzipped the hard case without ceremony. Inside, nested in foam that had been custom cut with surgeon-level precision, was a rifle that nobody at FOB Kestrel had seen before. Not the model, not the configuration, not the suppressor system attached to the barrel that was longer than standard and matte finish to eliminate any reflection signature. The optic was enormous, purpose-built, the kind that didn't come through normal procurement channels. Hayes, who had followed her in without anyone inviting him, went completely still. His mouth opened slightly. Okafor didn't react. He'd been in enough rooms with enough serious equipment to know that the appropriate response to something you didn't expect was to keep your expression neutral and ask the right questions. What's your range qualification? He asked. Delia looked at him steadily. The range they tested me at topped out at 1,800 meters, she said. I stopped the evaluation at 2,100 because the target stand couldn't go any farther. Silence. And who certified that evaluation? Okafor's voice was even. Sockham, she said. The paperwork is in the packet I transmitted to your S2 at 0500 this morning. Vasquez was already pulling up the file. Her expression shifted as she read, not dramatically, not with obvious reaction, just a subtle recalibration around the jaw. The kind of shift that meant she was reading something she hadn't expected and was deciding how to process it. Her qualification score is listed as Vasquez started. I don't need you to read it out loud, Delia said. Not rude, not sharp, just factual. I just need a vehicle to the ridge staging point and current weather data for the valley. Wind speed and direction for the last 2 hours, not the forecast. Actual recorded. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. The valley below was bleeding. 17 men were behind a wall with 2 Kia and a clock running the wrong way. Vasquez, he said. Get her what she needs. The ridge trail was not for people who were afraid of the dark or the altitude or the particular kind of silence that settles over high terrain in the last hour before dawn. It was made of loose shale and old goat paths and the occasional rusted stake that someone had hammered in years ago for reasons nobody alive could remember anymore. Delia climbed it with the hard case on her back and a spotter scope in her vest and the wind data memorized, not written down. She moved the way she always moved in terrain like this. Not fast, not slow. Measured. Like the mountain had a metabolism and she'd matched hers to it. Behind her, no one followed. She'd asked for that specifically. You want to go up alone? Hayes had said, still in the ops tent, voice carrying the unsteady energy of someone who'd been awake too long and was watching a situation go sideways in slow motion. I don't want anything, she'd said. I need the ridge clear. A second person becomes a variable. And if something happens to you up there, She'd looked at him with the kind of patience that lives on the other side of a very long time, spent being asked questions by people who hadn't thought them through. Then you'll know it happened because you'll stop getting results. She'd left it there. Now, halfway up the trail, she paused. Not because she was tired, because the wind had shifted. 2 degrees, maybe 3 from the northwest. She pulled the small weather instrument from her vest, confirmed it, logged the number mentally, adjusted 3 variables in a calculation that ran silently in a part of her mind she'd spent years developing. It took 4 seconds. She kept climbing. At the 1,400-meter mark, she found a natural depression in the limestone, a shallow pocket where the rock curved and created a natural berm approximately 60 centimeters high. It faced northeast. It gave her a sight line across the entire valley. Bravo element's position at the wall, both ridgeline firing positions, the collapsed extraction corridor, and a third position she'd identified on the drone feed that the ops team hadn't logged yet. She did not set up immediately. She lay flat on her stomach in the rock and observed for 11 minutes with a spotter scope before touching the rifle. 11 minutes of watching, noting, logging, the way shadows moved, which meant where heat sources were. The micro variations in dust patterns near position alpha that told her someone up there had shifted their weight in the last hour. The stillness at position Bravo that told her the shooter there was disciplined, controlled, not a novice. None of this made her pause. It just made her patient. She radioed down exactly once before setting up. Her voice was low, measured, carrying no weight beyond the information it contained. Kestrel Ops, Nightshade. I'm at elevation. Confirm Bravo element status. Vasquez's voice came back through controlled static. Bravo is pinned. 2 additional wounded in the last 40 minutes. They cannot move without taking fire. Time of last enemy contact from position Alpha. 19 minutes ago. 1 round fired toward the eastern corner of the wall. Copy. A pause. I'll need radio silence from this point. No transmissions to my frequency unless I initiate. A longer pause from the ops side. Not hesitation. Assessment. Then Okafor's voice, not Vasquez's. Confirmed. Radio silence. Nightshade, you're clear. She switched off the receive function, kept transmit available, and began assembling her position. Down in the valley, behind the crumbling southern wall of what had once been a storage facility for agricultural equipment, Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb was counting his options. He had 17 people, 2 dead, 4 wounded, 3 of the wounded mobile, 1 who was not. He had ammunition for approximately another 2.5 hours of sustained contact, less if they had to fight their way out. He had a medic who was running low on the supplies that mattered most, and he had a radio that kept spitting static in every direction except the one that would tell him help was coming. Webb was 38, 3 tours. The kind of veteran who had learned to store fear in a compartment so small it barely existed, who experienced tactical emergencies the way a surgeon experienced complicated procedures, not without awareness of the stakes, but with all of that awareness focused into function rather than reaction. He'd been told Nightshade was in the AO. Someone in the ops chain had passed the word through a side channel, not official, not confirmed. Just a name, a call sign, and the particular tone that people used when they said something they wanted you to hear but couldn't afford to say loudly. Nightshade. He'd heard the name twice before. Once in a debrief room at Bragg, where someone was describing a confirmed shot at 2,060 meters under crosswind conditions that had ended a 6-week crisis in a single trigger pull. The person telling the story hadn't used the call sign, but the description had been specific enough that people who knew filled in the blank on their own. The second time was from a SEAL he'd met at Bagram, who'd stopped mid-sentence, looked around the room, and said, "If Nightshade is on your side, you don't need to tell anyone. You'll just notice that the problem stops." Now Webb pressed his back against the crumbling wall, listened to the valley go quiet in the wrong way, and waited. Position Alpha was 1,140 meters from the wall, roughly northeast. The shooter there was good, patient. He'd been in position for hours, which meant he was conditioned for the wait and wasn't burning nervous energy. He fired selectively, not randomly. He was managing a suppression zone, not just shooting. That was the more dangerous profile. Unpredictable shooters telegraphed their anxiety. This one telegraphed nothing. Delia watched position Alpha through her optic for 6 minutes before she understood his exact rhythm. Not approximated. Exact. She could see the fractional displacement of dust when he adjusted his position. She could see the thermal variation at the edge of his concealment. She was 1,140 meters above and across from him, in shadow, motionless, with no reflective surface, no heat signature worth reading from his angle, and no sound that traveled through the wind in his direction. She was invisible. Position Bravo was 980 meters from her depression, 890 from the wall. The second shooter, also disciplined, also patient, but he was working with the first one, not independently. There was a coordination pattern in their firing cadence, suppression alternating so that Bravo element never had a clean window. It was orchestrated, professional. She needed to account for a variable. If she eliminated position Alpha first, Bravo would immediately adjust. He'd pull back from his current line of sight, likely shift 15 to 20 meters left where the natural overhang would cover his repositioning. She'd have approximately 8 seconds before he moved, and she'd lose the angle. 8 seconds. She calculated it 3 different ways, arrived at the same answer all 3 times, and settled into her breathing. 4 in, hold, 6 out. 4 in, hold, 6 out. The wind was steady now, 7 kilometers per hour, northwest. Not ideal. Manageable. She acquired position Alpha in her optic. The shooter's position was partially concealed by a limestone overhang and a spray of dry brush that he'd used as natural camouflage. Effective against anyone looking from the valley floor. Invisible against anyone looking from above and across. She was looking from above and across. 4 in, hold. Position Alpha was no longer a variable. Then she moved, not slowly, not fast, with that calibrated precision that lived in the space between, the kind that meant every movement was exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. For seconds to acquire Bravo. The angle had changed as predicted. He was adjusting, shifting left toward the overhang. She was already ahead of it. The second shot followed, the first with the kind of interval that people in sniper school studied and almost never successfully replicated under pressure. Under wind. Under the weight of knowing that 17 people behind a wall were waiting for something to change. It changed. Position Bravo went silent. In the valley, the sound of 2 suppressed rounds at 1,100 meters arrived as nothing. Not silence, exactly. More like the absence of the thing that had been. Webb heard it before he processed it. The cessation of fire from both ridgeline positions simultaneously, which was not how engaged shooters behaved, which was not a tactical withdrawal, which was something else entirely. He waited 4 seconds. Nothing from Alpha. Nothing from Bravo. He radioed his point man on the left flank. Reyes. Movement check, left side. Negative movement, Sergeant. Both positions static. Webb pressed his hand flat against the wall. Static meant down. Static meant something had happened on that ridge that he hadn't seen and couldn't account for. His radio crackled once. A single transmission. No preamble, no call and response protocol. Just a voice that was low and measured and carried the exact same emotional weight as a weather report. Kestrel Ops, Nightshade. Alpha and Bravo are down. Third position, grid 22 Tango, northeast offset 140, is active. 2 personnel, not yet engaged. Advise Bravo element they have a movement window. Estimate 4 to 6 minutes before third position can acquire the corridor. Silence on the Kestrel Ops net. Then Okafor's voice, and the only way you'd know it surprised him with a half-beat delay that wouldn't have been there if he'd been expecting it. Nightshade, copy. Bravo element is being advised now. Webb was already moving. 17 people, 4 to 6 minutes, 1 exit window. He didn't question the intelligence. He didn't ask for confirmation. He'd been behind that wall long enough to know that when the universe offers you a door, you don't stand there evaluating the quality of the hinges. Move, 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 he said. Corridor now. Leave nothing behind. The third position was the one the ops team hadn't logged. Delia had identified it on the drone feed from shadow variation that was inconsistent with the terrain profile at that grid point. 2 personnel, static waiting. The reserve element. The contingency in case the suppression at Alpha and Bravo ended early. Positioned to cover the extraction corridor and turn it back into a kill zone the moment Bravo element tried to use it. She had 4 minutes before they were in a position to engage. She had 2 rounds to fire. The third position was 890 meters northeast of her depression, 40 meters of lateral angle from her original setup. She shifted her position by 60 centimeters, not standing, not crouching, moving with the ground, like the ground was moving and she was just part of it. The wind was still 7 kilometers per hour northwest. It hadn't wavered. She acquired the first of the 2 personnel through her optic. The math didn't take long. It never did. She'd run these calculations so many thousands of times that they no longer felt like calculations. They felt like perception, like looking at a distance and simply knowing. 2 shots, 2 seconds between them. Both confirmed. The extraction corridor opened at 0531 hours and 17 people, 2 dead, for wounded, 13 operational. Moved through it in the gray pre-dawn light at a pace that said something about the kind of people they were. Not running, moving, disciplined, structured, each person carrying what needed to be carried. No one breaking formation for the sake of fear. Webb made it through last, the way a sergeant first class always made it through last. He looked back once at the ridgeline before the corridor closed behind him. He didn't see anything up there. No figure, no glint, no indication that someone was in that rock at all. He kept moving. At FOB Kestrel, the op center had gone quiet the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that nobody quite has the language for yet. The drone feed showed the valley. The wall. 17 personnel moving through the extraction corridor at 0531. The 4 positions on the ridgeline, Alpha, Bravo, and the 2-person reserve, inactive. Vasquez sat at her terminal and didn't type anything. Hay stood near the entrance with his coffee going cold in his hand. Okafor stood at the map table with his arms crossed, looking at the same grid references he'd been looking at for 6 hours, which now meant something completely different. "Nightshade," he said, not into the radio, just the word into the room. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The radio crackled once. Not with a full transmission. Just 3 words, and then static, and then nothing. "Corridor is clear." That was it. No status update, no position report, no indication of what came next or where she was going. Just 3 words and the static that followed them. By the time the extraction convoy reached the FOB at 0619, Okafor had sent 2 people up the ridge trail to confirm the position and document the scene. They came back at 0840 with photographs and a report that nobody argued with and almost nobody could fully explain. For confirmed positions, for confirmed results, all long range, all suppressed, all in conditions that the team's senior marksmanship instructor later described in his written assessment with a vocabulary that was precise and slightly odd in the way that only precision can produce in people who understand precision. Wind at 7 kilometers, northeast offset, 2 sequential targets at range, for second engagement window at the 3rd position, both confirmed. Estimated distance to 3rd position, 927 meters. He didn't write anything else. He underlined the 927 meters. Put his pen down. In the medical bay, Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb sat on the edge of a cot while the medic worked on the wound in his left forearm that he'd been ignoring for 4 hours because there were other things to do. He watched the ceiling fan turn slowly above him, the kind of fan that exists in every military medical bay in every hot country on Earth, always slightly off balance, always making a sound like it's thinking about stopping. One of his men, Private Delacroix, who was 22 and had been on his first deployment when the night began, came and sat down 2 cots over. He'd been in the valley the whole time. He'd heard the shots that weren't shots, or rather hadn't heard them, which was the point. "Who was it?" Delacroix asked. Not to anyone specifically. To the room. The medic didn't answer. Webb looked at the ceiling fan. "Call sign Nightshade." "Never heard of it. Most people haven't." Delacroix was quiet for a moment. "Is she?" he started, then stopped, as if he hadn't decided how to finish the sentence. Webb looked at him. "She what?" Delacroix seemed to be working through something. "Is she like just one person?" out there, by herself. Webb didn't answer immediately. He thought about the ridgeline, the silence that had descended on both positions simultaneously. The transmission that had been so calm it might have been describing the weather. The three final words before the static closed over everything. Yeah, he said finally. Just one person. Delacroix absorbed this. And nobody called her. They called the call sign. She answered. Webb's jaw tightened once. That's how it works. The hard case was back in Delia's hands by 0700. She descended the ridge in the same measured way she'd climbed it, by a different route, one that didn't match any trail on the official maps. She arrived at the FOB vehicle entrance not through the main gate, but through the eastern access point, which was technically for logistics only, and which nobody monitored between 0600 and 0700 because of a shift overlap that the security protocols hadn't yet corrected. She noted the gap as she passed through it, wrote nothing down, filed it in the same mental inventory that held the sandbag shift at the motor pool and the unmanned south tower from the morning before. She cleaned the rifle in a supply room that she'd been assigned for the duration of her stay, which according to the paperwork was 48 hours. Nobody was in the supply room when she arrived. Nobody came in while she was there. She worked in silence and deliberate motion, breaking the weapon down, cleaning each component with the focused attention of someone who understood that the instrument deserved exactly this much care and not one fraction less. When it was done, she reassembled it, placed it back in the foam-lined case, closed the latches with 2 clean clicks. Then she sat on the floor of the supply room with her back against the wall and her knees bent and her eyes closed, and for 11 minutes she did nothing at all. Not sleeping, not reviewing, just stopping, the way you stop after something has demanded everything and you owe the silence a few minutes in return. At 0718, she stood up, picked up the case, and walked to the ops center. Okafor was still there. He looked like he'd aged a fraction in the last hour. The way people age when they've been through something they'll carry with them, and the adrenaline has finally started to withdraw. He looked at her when she entered. The case. Her face. For confirmed, he said, "Yes, sir. Your third position. We hadn't identified that in the briefing." "No, sir." "How did you?" Shadow variance on the drone feed. The thermal overlay would have shown it if someone had looked at the gradient data against the terrain profile for that grid. Okafor was quiet. "I'll have my team debrief with you on the drone analysis protocols. I'll write up my observations before I leave," she said. "You can use them however is useful." He studied her for a moment. Not with skepticism, not anymore. With the kind of attention people give to things they're trying to understand fully before they respond. "Webb's element is safe," he said. "Yes, sir. 2 of those personnel have families at Fort Campbell. A third is an only son. One of the wounded has a daughter who's 4 months old." He said it plainly, without performance, without trying to make it land a particular way. Just the facts of the thing. "You should know that." Something moved across Delia's expression. Not a smile, not quite. More like recognition. Like someone acknowledging a fact that mattered in a way that didn't require a verbal answer. "I do know," she said quietly. Okafor nodded once. He didn't say thank you. She wouldn't have wanted him to. They both understood that this wasn't the kind of thing that fit comfortably inside the word thank you. That some actions existed at a scale where the usual language became insufficient and the best you could do was acknowledge it and let the acknowledgement stand. "Your transport back to Bagram is scheduled for 1400, he said. "Yes, sir. Vasquez will have the weather data and AO assessment ready for your review before you leave. Standard post-operation documentation." She nodded, picked up the hard case, turned toward the door. "Cross," he said. She stopped but didn't turn. "There'll be a commendation recommendation. I'm going to file it." "A beat." "I appreciate that, sir," she said. "But the record doesn't need my name on it to be true." She walked out. In the mess tent at 0830, Specialist Hayes was eating eggs that had been reconstituted from powder that didn't taste like eggs in any meaningful sense of the word. He ate them mechanically, the way you ate food at a FOB after a long night. Not for pleasure, just to keep the system running. Across the table, a signals corporal named Birch was scrolling through something on a tablet he shouldn't have had in the mess tent, but that nobody was going to argue about this morning. He stopped scrolling, looked up. "Hey," he said. You know who Nightshade is? Hayes looked at him. Why? Because someone in the Bravo Element After Action report asked Command to put a commendation in. And Command's internal response was, he looked at the tablet. Declined as filed. Will be classified and archived under SOCOM's Special Operations Record. Restricted access. Authorization required. Hayes put his fork down. So nobody's going to know? Not officially. Birch put the tablet face down on the table. Unofficially, Webb's Element knows. The ops team knows. Okafor knows. He shrugged. That's usually how it works with the real ones. Hayes looked at his eggs. Thought about the woman with the hard case who had walked through the eastern access point at 0700 and looked at FOB Kestra the way you'd look at a building you'd already mapped from the outside before ever stepping in. You know what's strange? He said. What? She walked in. Just walked in. One rucksack and that case. And I thought, he stopped. Thought what? I thought she was a photographer. Birch looked at him for a moment. Then he laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was the kind of thing that, once it was out in the air, was the only appropriate response. Hayes laughed too, briefly, then stopped. 4 shots, he said. I looked at the report. 4 confirmed, 4 positions, different elevations, changing wind, under 8 minutes total engagement time. Birch said nothing. She asked for radio silence and went up that ridge alone in the dark, Hayes said. And when it was done, she transmitted 3 words, and that was it. Just, he shook his head. Corridor is clear. A moment of quiet between them that carried more than the words had. You gonna tell anybody? Birch asked. Hayes looked at his eggs again. Who would I even tell? The transport helicopter lifted off FOB Kestrel at 14:03. 2 minutes late, which was exceptional by local standards. Delia sat against the interior bulkhead with the hard case across her knees and her eyes on the window and the valley below. The Darshan Valley looked different from the air, less like a wound, more like geography. Just terrain, just limestone and shadow, and the dry creek line that cut through the center of the valley floor and had been there since long before any of this. The wall where Bravo Element had sheltered was a small rectangle of stone from this altitude, barely visible, already ordinary looking. She looked at it for as long as she could see it. Next to her, the only other passenger in the helicopter was a young specialist from a supply unit being rotated out for a medical evaluation. He'd glanced at the hard case twice since boarding and was now looking carefully at the opposite bulkhead in the way that people looked at things that weren't the thing they were actually thinking about. He cleared his throat after 5 minutes. Ma'am, you don't have to answer this. She looked at him. But were you up on that ridge last night? I heard some of the guys talking about. I was at the FOB last night, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression moved, subtle and uncertain, trying to decide whether to push or accept. Then he looked back at the opposite bulkhead. Yes, ma'am, he said. She looked back at the window. The valley had disappeared behind the ridgeline now. Nothing but mountains in every direction, the same broken spine of rock that had been there for millions of years and would be there for millions more, indifferent to everything that happened in the valleys between. She thought about the 4 positions on the ridgeline, the wind data, the 8-second she'd had between the first shots, and the moment Bravo's reserve position could have repositioned. She ran through each decision the way a surgeon replayed a difficult procedure, not with doubt, but with the systematic review of someone who understood that you only got better by being honest with yourself about every variable. She'd done it right. She knew that. But knowing it and reviewing it were different things, and she would always review it. That was the job. At Fort Bragg, 4 days later, Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb sat in a debrief room across from 2 officers from SOCOM documentation and went through the events of the night at Darshan Valley in the methodical, sequence-by-sequence language of someone who had done this many times before. He answered questions accurately. He documented what he'd seen, what he'd heard, what he decided and why. When they asked about the external support that had cleared the ridgeline positions, he said the same thing he'd been saying for 4 days, the same thing he'd say for years afterward when people who'd heard versions of the story asked him to confirm or deny. I don't know who it was, he said. I only know the call sign. And the call sign was Nightshade. The 2 officers looked at each other across the table. The junior one wrote something in the margin of the briefing packet. And that's all you have? the senior officer asked. Webb looked at him steadily. I have 17 people who came home, he said. I think that's enough. The senior officer held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at the briefing packet. He clicked his pen once. He didn't write anything in the margin. Some things didn't need to be written to be true. No one could reach the sniper. That's what they said in the 47 minutes when the valley was burning and the radio was full of static and command had run out of conventional answers. No one could reach her. No one could send help. No one could even confirm she was up there. But 17 people came home. And if you ask the ones who were behind that wall what saved them, they'll tell you what Webb told the debrief officers. They'll tell you about the silence that fell over both ridgeline positions at exactly the same moment. They'll tell you about 3 words over a radio that hadn't spoken in hours. They'll tell you about a window that opened in the dark at 0531, when by all logic and prior evidence, it should have stayed closed. They'll tell you your call sign. They won't tell you her name. Most of them don't know it. And the ones who do understand why it doesn't get said in ordinary rooms. But they'll tell you this. She was one person on a ridge in the dark with a wind she'd memorized and a calculation she'd run 3 ways and a decision she'd made alone, because that's what the moment required, and she was the person the moment had. And she answered when they called. That's what the real ones do. They don't announce themselves. They don't wait for recognition. They don't need the room to understand what just happened before they've already moved on to what comes next. They just answer to their call sign, and then the corridor opens. And then 17 people come home. Have you ever been saved by someone who never let you see their face? Have you ever been in a situation where the most dangerous person in the room was also the quietest one? And do you think real capability, the kind that doesn't need witnesses, doesn't need applause, doesn't even need anyone to know the name, is the rarest form of strength there is? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. Then tap that like button, hit subscribe, and make sure you've got the bell icon on so you never miss the next mission. Share this story with someone who still thinks strength has to be loud to be real. Your next video is already on your screen. Go watch it now. We'll see you tomorrow.